All right, so you should see my StatCrunch screen.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to switch out first to this other screen with the document. So I'm going to use this first problem. The data, I copied the problem from somewhere else, but I'm going to use the data, and I'm going to do the 5-number summary, calculate the fences, and look for outliers, because that's part of the written assignment. So you're going to have to find the fences which are not in StatCrunch. So that one's going to be done by hand. And then after that problem, we'll do one from chapter 4. And this is basically what you're going to see in chapter 4. Compute the correlation coefficient, figure out if there's a relation using the p-value, find the equation, and do some predicting. So we'll run through one example of everything. And again, these 2 chapters are definitely more straightforward than the rest, I think. All right, so in this problem, I've got a list of 10 values, and even though we're not calculating standard deviation and variance in this one, there are problems that are going to ask you to do standard deviation and variance, and you've got to know whether it's a sample or a population. Population, we use that unadjusted calculation, but for a sample, we use the regular standard deviation and variance. Yeah, okay. This one would be an example of a sample, because we're told that the men, let me get my pen going. We're told that the men were selected at random, and that means that they were taken from a bigger pool. So we know that this is a sample. In this problem, it's asking for the 5-number summary, which is the minimum, Q1, the median, Q3, and the max. But if you had to compute mean, standard deviation range, any of those other calculations, you would do it in the same way we're about to do it. So I'm going to switch over to the StatCrunch screen. Stat, summary stats, columns. Pick the column that you want. And the ones that are already selected have everything I want in it, right? Q1 and Q3 are there, min and max are there. Also, the median is there. So I'm going to take all the ones that they've done, and I'll just ignore the ones I don't need. So let me do this. So let me try that a little better. Get it all on the same screen. So I know the minimum is listed as 158. Now we don't need StatCrunch for that, right? We could look at it and see what's the smallest value. The maximum is 286, same thing. The quartiles were 170 and 203. And one thing about the MyMathLab test is that it asks you for Q1, Q2, and Q3. Just remember that the median is Q2. Mm-hmm. The median here was 186.5. So that's the 5-number summary. On the written one, I think I list what those 5 things are, so you have a spot to write each one. The lower and upper fences, before we can do that, I do need the interquartile range. IQR, that's just Q3 minus Q1, or 33. The formulas for the fences for the lower fence, it's Q1 minus 1.5 IQR. For the upper fence, it's Q3 plus 1.5 IQR. And so when I do these by hand, since 1.5 IQR is in both calculations, I think it's easier to figure that part out first and then write down that result. So 1.5 times the IQR, 1.5 times 33 is 49.5. So I can just copy that into my formulas. So 170 minus 49.5 is 120.5. And 203 plus 49.5 is 252.5. Just a quick note on this one. Sometimes students will subtract in the upper fence instead of add. Sometimes they use Q1 again instead of Q3. Just be careful that you're using the the two different quartiles, Q1 and Q3, one you subtract, one you add.
Okay.
Are there any outliers here? What we're looking for are values smaller than 120.5, and I don't see any of those. Or values above 252.5, and there is one. 286 is an outlier. So this is how you would find the outliers using fences. Now, StatCrunch will show us the outliers as well, but it won't tell you the fences. So when I ask for the fences, you have to use this by hand formula. That's the only way to do it. Let me switch over and make the graph. Graph, box plot. The only thing that I think is a good idea after you select the column is to draw them horizontally. It's not necessary. You can draw a box plot that goes up and down too, and that's fine. But the box that says use fences to identify outliers is already checked, so that helps us. And again, I can see that the outlier is 286. It's marked on the graph. Now, in terms of, let me slide this to the right, the left. In terms of what you're doing on the exam, so I've got this graph that I need to get onto my paper. And if I've printed it out, I've got to do a rough sketch by hand. Label what you see. I know the box runs between 170 and 203, so 170 is about here. 203 is about here. I see the median at 186.5, maybe about there. The line goes out to the minimum, which was 158. And the upper whisker only goes out to the next highest value before the outlier, and that was at 247. And then there's going to be a mark out here at 286 for the outlier. So the idea is that when I hold this paper up to my screen, it just has to resemble that graph. Okay. It doesn't have to be perfect if you're sketching it by hand. Now, another thing is if I put the mouse over the box plot, I can see the lower limit, Q1. So I can label those on my graph. My lower limit, again, the minimum was 158. Q1 was at 170. The median, 186.5. Q3 was 203. And the upper limit is right here, 247. And then finally, I know from above, my value for the outlier was 286. So again, it just has to resemble the graph. Let her in. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfectly scaled. The idea is just that when I hold it up next to my screen, I've got to be able to say, oh yeah, this is they did it the right way, and then we're all set. So the only other things in chapter 3 that I didn't do here were things like mean, standard deviation, variance, but those are all done in the same place. And again, that was under stat, summary stats, and columns. Now, one other thing about the standard deviation and variance that is in the My Math Lab portion, you saw in the homework where they give you, let me just write it on here. They, problem A asks for standard deviation, and they have this, and you have to pick which one to use. And then for variance, they have this, and you got to pick the right one. Again, use S whenever you're dealing with a sample, and use sigma whenever you're dealing with a population.
Okay.
Because if you calculate it correctly, but put it in the wrong box, it's going to mark it wrong. Now, I will go back through and check that. If you had the right value, but in the wrong box, I'll give you partial credit on that problem. But the easiest way to avoid the problem is to pick the right box to begin with. And again, I saw that happen several times in the homework, but you've seen it once before, so now hopefully that part comes through.
Yeah.
So again, that's chapter 3, some basic calculations from summary stats. I think the only part that I would be real careful with are the fences. just make sure that you can calculate those by hand, because StatCrunch won't give you that. The other half of today is from chapter 4. And so the problem that I have for that one, I've got a listing of barometric pressures for different cyclones along with the wind speed. So the idea is we're trying to see if the pressure of the cyclone has anything to do with the speed of the wind that goes with it. A cyclone's like kind of like our hurricanes that we have on our eastern coast. And so you're going to have to, the problem on the midterm will be different. The written one, you'll have to type these values in, but I've got them in the StatCrunch group page. And we can do all of this in one shot. So I'm going to read through the problem, and I see I need the correlation coefficient. I can see that I need to figure out if there's a relation, so that means I'm going to need the p-value. I need the equation, and I'm making a prediction for 960 millibars. So when I ask StatCrunch to generate the equation, I'm also going to give it the 960 that I need. On the written midterm, part 1, the everything is based off of one data set. So you can do it the same way I'm about to do it. In my lab, I think there's a couple of different problems, and you'll have to choose, each time it may ask you for just the equation, it may ask you for just the correlation, the scatter plot, whatever it may be. But the one on the part 1 is going to be an all-encompassing, all in one spot kind of problem. So let me get rid of this graph. And all the calculations I need are under stat, regression, simple linear.
Mr. Woodbury?
Yes.
I just had a question. I'm sorry, I was late.
Oh, yeah, no worries.
For chapter 3, the maximum is always the highest number, the 277?
Yeah. So in the set of data that I had, the maximum was actually 286. 286. But I think on the one you're working on, 277 was the biggest. Okay.
See, I think I'm glad you went over that. I saw it at the last minute, but thank you. Okay, that was my only question. I was just
awesome. That's a good sign.
Sorry, I was late. The buying this house is insane.
Yeah, chapter 3 is pretty straightforward. It's basic calculations, a little bit of handwork, but everything comes right out of StatCrunch for you.
Okay, because I was able to do that one on my own yesterday. I just wanted to make sure I did it right today with you guys. Awesome. On the.
Very good. For the regression, you may also have to figure out which variable is X and which variable is Y. Now here I told you which was which, but the idea is that we're thinking that the pressure of the center of that cyclone affects how fast the wind goes. So the independent variable X would be pressure. The result of that pressure would be Y, the wind speed. But in some of the MyLab problems, you're gonna have to figure that out. So the X variable was pressure. The Y variable was wind speed. And the only other thing I have to do is down here where it says prediction of Y, I'm going to enter that value that I had, which was 960, and compute. Now, this is like one-stop shopping. It has everything you need. I'm going to jump to the second screen real quickly. If you needed the scatter plot, that's right there without the line. There's a MyMathLab problem that also asks you, besides clicking on the right scatter plot, to pick on the right plot that has the scatter plot and the line on it. That's both of those in one right there. On the first page, I've got my correlation coefficient where it says R. Let me go ahead and share this screen. So my value of R is listed as negative 0.990, rounded to 3 places. And what that means is that as X gets bigger, it looks like Y is definitely getting smaller. So we have a negative relation is the way it looks. Again, the closer that is to 1 or -1, the stronger the relation is. But the way we really measure the strength is through the p-value. I didn't make the window big enough. The p-value is just off the screen here. Let me make that a little wider. But the thing to remember is that the p-value is always the one that matches. It's the one in the slope row, but it also shows up down here as well. So the p-value is 0.0002. And because that's smaller than 0.05, that means there is a linear relation. And if it wasn't below 0.05, there's no relation, and technically you're not supposed to use the equation at that point either. The question here does ask if it's a positive or a negative relation. This is negative, and there's two ways to think about that. First, the correlation coefficient is negative. There's actually three ways to think about it. Second, the slope of the line is negative, negative 1.4 times pressure. And finally, if you look at the graph, you would see that it goes down to the right. So as x gets bigger, y gets smaller. All of those things say it's a negative relation, and any of those are okay. The least squares equation, I'm going to round to 2 decimal places here. So I've got win equals 1496.78 minus 1.44 pressure. One quick note about MyMathLab for that problem is that sometimes it asks you for them in the opposite order, right? It wants the slope first. So, you know, this could look like this in MyMathLab. Those are both the same line. Also be careful on the written part. I don't think I gave you instructions for where to round, and I really am not that worried about where you round those results to. But in my lab, they're going to say to round it to a certain number of places. Just be careful with that. Finally, use the equation to predict what happens at 960 millibars. Let me scroll down a little bit. And where it says the x value was 960, the predicted value of y is 111.8. Mark that down. So in chapter 4, you can really do everything in one shot on the part 1 of the exam. On part 2, you're going to be doing these in little pieces instead. Like I mentioned, there's one problem that asks for the scatter plot, the equation, and the graph of the line with the scatter plot. And another one, I think it asks for the equation and a prediction. I think there's another problem that just asks for correlation coefficient. So you can do them all the same way. I like this approach because you can do it all in one shot. All right, so that's chapter 4. Do you guys have any questions from either of these 2 chapters for me?
On chapter 4, where did you get the least squares equation?
So the least squares equation is in the output. It's the 3rd line down.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's the spot that will always be in. Also, they're listed right here in this first column. This is the 1496, that's the number without the variable. The negative 1.44, that's the slope. That's the number that goes with the variable. But it's better to just take it off of that 3rd line.
Okay, and then we have to like flip it around, right? The negative 1.44.
You don't have to flip it around. On the part 1, you can write it any way you want. But on part 2, just be careful what order MyMathLab asks for that in. So the equation's there on the 3rd line. The correlation is on the 5th line. The p-value is in the bottom right corner of that first box.
Okay.
And then the prediction, if you make one, will always be down lower. Now,
Okay.
Coming back to this screen, obviously, I also could have just plugged in 960 for x in this equation here and done the arithmetic, but I don't want to mess around with arithmetic. I'll let the computer do that. It's better than I am with arithmetic. And so I think that that's the safer way to go.
Right. My numbers, even though I've tried to put it in the calculator, right, I'm like,
Oh no, yeah, you can hit the wrong button. It's pretty easy. You know, I think the real secret to being a master at your craft is knowing when to use your tools. And, you know, yeah, I can do a lot of these calculations by pencil and paper, but why would I use pencil and paper when I have a calculator? But if I have a computer that'll do it, why would I use the calculator too, right? You want to pick the right tool for it.
yeah.
And when the points matter, and they matter this week, don't leave anything to chance. Any others?
Yeah.
If not, what? Oh, go ahead, Toby.
Back on chapter 3, when you had, sorry, I had some interruptions here, but
Oh yeah, no.
when you go to the stat crunch and there's like all the data is already input, how do I determine which is which for these problems? Like I think the one you did in chapter 3.
Yeah.
So I go
So
to stat crunch and then
yeah. So on your end, what you'll do is you'll type all the values you're given in one column.
okay.
And I would only do one problem on each page, and then get rid of StatCrunch, reopen it with a clean data sheet. But you want to type them all in one column. And then when we get to this point, summary stats, columns, you want to pick the column that has your data in it. Now, oftentimes these will say var1, var2, var3, but I had titled it cholesterol because I had two sets on the same one and I wanted to keep them straight. But if you're only doing one problem at a time, you don't need to name them. It's not important. I do think, though, for the chapter 4, it's better to name them because then when your equation comes up, you'll have it just exactly right. So after you pick the column, then you can select any of the calculations here under statistics. For the one I did, everything that I needed was already pre-checked, so I didn't mess around with selecting anything new. But if I wanted to do just a 5-number summary, I would pick min, Q1, oops, min, Q1, median, Q3, and max. And then I can get them all in one shot in the order I want them. But again, that order doesn't really matter as long as you write the right number in the right place. Tracy, before you got here, one thing that I was mentioning that I don't know if you were here for that or not is, I'm writing on something you can't see, is right here. In my lab, again, there's going to be problems that ask for standard deviation and variance, and they're going to list both the symbol for sample and population of those two. Be sure that you pick the right one for the problem that you're doing.
Okay. Oh, you know what? I think in my lab too, because I started some of that, the Q1, Q2, Q3.
Oh yeah, I mentioned that too. So Q2 is just another word for median. So when you're looking for Q2 in StatCrunch, you need to just click on median instead.
Okay, because it gives you Q1 and Q3.
Yeah.
So you just need the, okay.
Yeah, the median, and
okay.
where they say Q2, you'll fill in with the median. So the idea is that the first quarter of the data stops at Q1, the second stops at Q2, the third stops at Q3, but we already have a name for that Q2, and that's median.
Okay, and those are the quartiles that they're talking about, or
Right.
however you say it. Okay.
That's right. Now, one suggestion for all of you, like that maybe watching this afterwards, I think the best thing that you can do is in the practice midterm, try the problems from chapter 3. Check your answers to the answer key. And if you have those right, try them on the actual midterm part 1 and go into my lab and try the ones in part 2 that come from that chapter. And you'll know which ones they are roughly: mean, median, range, standard deviation, box plots, outliers, that whole bit. Then repeat the whole cycle for chapter 4. Try the practice problem, the chapter 4 problem in the practice midterm. Once you're sure that you got those answers correct, move on to the real midterms and do those again. If you're struggling with any of those, there's one more place that I should show you here in my math lab. Let me get back to the main menu. Under exam review materials, midterm review links. Oh, by the way, there's a document if you want the problems from today. Document for Zoom 3 and 4. Midterm review links. Let me open up that page and say I'm having trouble with chapter 4. I can open up the chapter 4 document, which has, format that, which has main topics and a couple of practice problems that you can try. Then you can check your answers to the answer key for that same thing. where I have them worked out with all the results coming right out of StatCrunch. So again, it's another place where you can check your work and make sure you're doing these right before you jump into the ones that really count. All right, are we good? Anybody have any other questions?
No, I think I'm good here.
Okay, so I'll be around all day. I'm in a meeting from like 3 to 5, but if you send me an email, I'll get right back to you. And if I have to set up another Zoom session to help you out, like that's easy enough to do as well.
Yeah, that's awesome of you. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thanks for being here. And for those of you watching at a later time, good luck. And tomorrow we'll do the same thing, but chapter 6 and 7. That one's going to be at 9 o'clock again. I had to push today back to 10 because today is my weekly grocery day, and I have to get in and out before the people show up, and it takes a while to clean all that stuff. So I didn't want to be rushed. So tomorrow we'll go back to 9 o'clock.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Stay well, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.
All right, bye.